Hi again, Alex with Common Sense Firearms Training. What we're going to talk about in this video is what's called ergonomics when it comes to the pistol grips that are out there with a lot of the semi-automatics that we see throughout the country. We're basically just going to kind of work off of three platforms that are kind of the mainstay of the firearms throughout the country. Most of them will be similar in some way, shape, or form to these, so you can kind of get an idea of what we're talking about when we discuss these. Obviously, probably the two most popular you're going to find are going to be your Glocks. These are plastic, by the way. They are not real firearms. Okay, there's nothing that can go in, nothing that can come out of it. So this is just a plastic piece, but they are made to scale so that they are relevant to the firearms that they're related to. But this one would be, for example, a Glock 17. Okay, very prominent firearm. Okay, this would be a 1911 platform. Most 1911s out there are pretty similar regardless of who makes it, whether it be Springfield or Colt or Kimber. Pretty much every gun manufacturer out there now has got their version of a 1911. So when we say 1911, we're not talking about a manufacturer so much as we are talking about the frame of the pistol itself and how it's designed. The 1911s are going to be pretty much any kind of a single stack, tends to be similar to that, with the exception of if it is a Sig Sauer specific, their 220s have pretty much the same grip on them as the 226s, even though it is a single stack. But the point is that with these three, we can actually see, for the most part, most of the stuff that's out there when it relates to ergonomics with the semi-automatic handguns of the day. And then this would be a Sig 226. This is very similar to pretty much all the other, what's called a double action, single action. That refers to the hammer that you see back here. When the firing commences with this, basically as you press the trigger, on the first trigger press, the hammer is going to be pulled back until you finish the trigger pull all the way through, at which point it'll let go of the hammer and engage the primer on the firing, the firing pin will engage the primer and send your bullet down the barrel. But then after the gun cycles, what happens is that hammer stays back and becomes a single action only, pretty much the same thing as we see with the 1911s. The big difference is obviously most 1911s can't fire in double action. There are some exceptions to that. And then with the Glocks, when it comes to the firing action, is called a striker fire. And that basically means that it's internalized. And what they kind of did with those is they just basically got rid of the hammers and made it so that the triggering mechanism releases the firing pin, which is itself housed and encased inside of a spring. That way the entire force of the spring goes into the primer, which basically makes them a little bit more stable in terms of versus a hammer strike, which loses some of its some of its striking capability as it goes forward on the forward action. So with that in mind, you kind of have to. Some people are saying that the hammer actions are kind of outdated. I disagree. I think they still have a great place in the world. They're very, very reliable, depending on which version you get. It just becomes a personal preference at that point. And remember, there's no perfect handgun. What we're going to do is we're going to kind of go oldest to newest, okay? So you can kind of follow with the progression of how these things got developed. We are going to talk about the ergonomics of the grip itself when it comes to the 1911, which was kind of the birth, I guess, of the semi-automatics. There's some other guns out there that were kind of in the works before this, but this was the one that kind of solidified itself as what a semi-automatic should be. So what we're going to talk about here with the ergonomics is when we talk about that, we're talking about literally kind of the angle of the grip in relation to the bore and in relation to your arm as we fire and manipulate the firearm. Now, one thing to note with this is that you see the hammer is cocked back on this. This is one of those evolutions we're going to talk about a little bit here, a little bit further on in the video. But this is a single action only, which means that when you press the trigger, the only thing it does is it puts the hammer forward to engage the primer. But if it's not cocked back, in most cases, then it will not fire. There are some 1911s that have been made double action, but those aren't the common that we see across the country. So what we're going to see, now we're going to talk about now though, with the ergonomics and how your wrist kind of falls in relation to holding on to the gun. When they designed these, they actually tried to come up with something that would be able to let your wrist handle the recoil of a firearm, and especially when it comes to the manipulations of everything happening up here on the top end. Whereas with revolvers, everything was pretty stationary. Even the cylinder would rotate, and that's fine. But the muzzle and the bullet, everything entered out at that one end. And what that meant was that as long as you could lock everything down on your grip, then you'd keep the muzzle down. That wasn't necessarily the case anymore when it comes to semi-automatics, because with all this top-heavy action that's moving up here as it fires, it creates cantilever effects, which is why they added what's called a beaver tail back here, or what's commonly known as a beaver tail. And what happens is and we'll get into the grip here in another video, but you definitely want to be high on that. But what we're talking about with the ergonomics is that as you press out and you're shooting, you should actually be basically having your wrist into kind of a position that you'll see if you were to punch a wall with your wrist in a vertical position, you're going to want to punch it with it pretty much in line with your forearm, because that's what the bone structure is capable of producing force management on. So when force is coming in on that wrist, it needs to kind of stay locked out to make sure that it distributes it evenly across all of the wrist and down your arm into your shoulders and into your sockets. That's what basically transfers the force and allows everything to operate the way it does. So when they built the 1911, they actually took that into consideration. A little known fact that's out there is actually any of you who are in carpentry or do any kind of plumbing or anything else that has a cordless drills or electronic drills, that angle on that drill is actually the same angle from a 1911, and this is where they got that angle from, because these were the guys who did all the research on that, and obviously the head of that was John Browning. So as we move forward a little bit, and we see kind of moving into some of the new age stuff that's a little bit more common, what they started seeing is, we're going to kind of hold these up together, and you'll see that even though this shoots a .45 caliber, which is a bigger bullet, it's actually a skinnier frame. And what they did was they started making 9mm, even before they were making 40 cals. 9mm has been around for a very long time. It's worldwide. Everybody uses 9 across the world. So what they started doing is they started making firearms that would take those 9s, and what they found they could do is they could actually what's called stagger the rounds inside of the magazine. So instead of it just being one bullet on top of one bullet on top of one bullet, they'd actually kind of sit offset a little bit, which gave them the ability to create more space for the bullets and increasing the capacity. But what they did in the process is they actually made it a little bit of a thicker frame. So when they made this thicker frame, what they had to kind of do with the ergonomics was they still had to kind of look into what was going to be the right recoil management. And what they found was, even though the frame's a little bit thicker, the force, the point of impact on when it comes to the handling the recoil, the force is still pretty much the same. So that action and that grip didn't really change a whole lot. Okay? Now, this is still probably one of the most comfortable firearms that I've ever shot. I love SIGs. I'm a big advocate of them. Not to say I don't like 1911s. They're a fantastic firing platform. But things changed a little bit when they started getting away from the double action firearms. And we're going to get into that a little bit more when we kind of go into the specifics of the guns themselves. But that kind of changed a little bit. Now, when we started going up into the new age stuff, and this is kind of more the newer stuff, we see the striker fires. What they did was they got rid of the hammer, okay? Everything's internalized now, and the grip, still pretty much a big blocky thing, so they can create a double stack in there. But what they started to change now was the angle of the grip, and this is more specific to Glocks than probably any other firearm. But what they changed was the grip on the angle, or excuse me, the angle on the grip was actually just a little bit more canted. And where this comes from is it actually comes out of, this is an Austrian-made gun, but where they got that grip angle was kind of goes back to the World War II Lugers. And the idea behind the Luger was if you just kind of pointed at something, that your fingers should fall right in line with it, and that's where the muzzle should end up. And so that's kind of where this concept came from. But what that kind of goes away from, though, now is that when we talk about that force mitigation or the force distribution throughout your arm, is now you have to kind of lock your wrist forward in a downward motion in order to get the right sight alignment in relation to the barrel. So when it comes to Glocks, they're a phenomenal firing system, but they do probably take a little bit more getting used to. If you've never fired a firearm out there and you just start with a Glock, then what you'll find is that it's actually kind of, you have to work backwards. You'll get used to this, and then you'll have to go back to some of the other stuff. But what ends up happening is if we basically put this and this together and then line up the angles here, okay, you can see the Glock behind is sticking up. And that's basically what happened, is they just changed the angle a little bit. So people who shoot Glocks kind of have to learn to lock their wrist down and hold it there, which it doesn't, once you get used to it, it's not that big a deal. But if you're not used to it, it actually can create a little bit of problems. And so what we talk about with the ergonomics is just basically whichever one's going to feel a little bit more comfortable for you. If you're a person who naturally just kind of points with your wrist locked down, then a Glock's probably going to fit you just fine. But not everyone does that. Some people point kind of more of a straight wrist, and I'm one of those people, so I shoot just fine with Glocks, but I actually tend to lean more towards the 1911s or the SIGs just for the ergonomics of the pistol. So when we talk about picking your handgun, this is one of those concepts that you can really take into consideration, and the most important thing, obviously, is what you're comfortable with. It's got to be something that you're going to feel like you can use, and more importantly, you can use it in a stressful situation when it counts. So, ergonomics of a handgun, something to think about. Again, get out, get educated, and stay safe.